Welcome back to Story Chaser, the podcast that uncovers the powerful human stories that too often go untold. I'm your host, Tara Ruff. I want you to imagine a moment. You're standing in an operating room, scrubbed in, gloved up. The patient is open on the table. You've trained for this your entire adult life. You gave up your 20s, your relationships, your sleep, your sense of self outside these walls. And in that moment, after being berated and torn down for the millionth time in your fourth year, the thing you spent your entire life becoming starts to feel impossible to survive. So you leave. You step away from the OR. And the only thought in your head is, if I can't be this, I want to die. That's not a hypothetical. That's Dr. Frances Mei Hardin. 5 years ago, in her own words, I left the OR believing that I had failed. That moment became something else entirely. The first crack in a system that demanded silence. Frances May was the person you wanted in the room when something went wrong. Biochemistry degree from Notre Dame, published an astrophysics paper at 16, completed one of the most grueling residencies in medicine, ENT, head and neck surgery. By every measure, a success. And she was breaking. And she's not alone. Every day in this country, a physician dies by suicide. Female doctors face a 76% higher risk than the general population. Nearly half report burnout, 1 in 5 show symptoms of depression, and up to 15% will struggle with addiction during their careers. And the system's response? A wellness app, a mindfulness seminar, a reminder to practice self-care. Frances May has a different word for what this is. She calls it silence. The silence that lets hospitals work residents 80 hours a week and call it training. The silence that makes doctors afraid to seek help because a diagnosis could cost them their license. The silence that keeps someone standing in a hospital bathroom at 2 a.m., Googling physician suicide and finding nothing. Meanwhile, the system is collapsing. The U.S. could be short nearly 200,000 doctors by the end of the next decade. Over 90 million Americans live in primary care deserts, and more than 138,000 nurses have walked away since 2022. We're losing the people we trust with our lives, and almost no one is asking who is looking after theirs. Frances May survived. She finished her training, and then she did the thing medicine tells you never to do. She talked about the abuse, the hazing dressed up as tradition, the shame she carried for years, and the way the system calls endurance professionalism and breaking down weakness. She said out loud what so many physicians only whisper. Medicine can be one of the most brutal, soul-crushing experiences you will ever go through. And when she realized her story alone would never be enough to change a system this broken, she walked away from clinical medicine entirely. She then founded the Hippocratic Collective, a media company built to do what no one inside the institution can: apply pressure until the walls give way, to reach the resident in that bathroom at 2 a.m. and say, I see you. You're not broken. The system is. This is a conversation about what happens when the people we trust to heal us are themselves breaking, about what it costs to build your entire identity around a profession and what it takes to survive when the identity shatters. So Frances May, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Tara. It's such a pleasure.
I wanted to start, after that kind of run through of a very traumatic experience you went through. And I imagine it's something you've relived many times. So 5 years ago, you stepped away from the OR in the middle of a case. Can you take me back to that moment? What was happening inside you in the hours, maybe even the weeks leading up to that moment?
Absolutely. So what's interesting and what I think is very necessary context for anyone who, is not in the OR, isn't necessarily in healthcare, as a resident physician, to leave the OR in the middle of a case, especially when it wasn't like to use the restroom. I didn't need water. I guess, I could have lied. I could have lied to the attending and to myself and been like, oh, I'm really sorry. I feel faint. Like, may I please go eat a peanut butter sandwich really quick? Something like that. But no, it felt very different. And I knew that because for me, it was the only time ever where, no, I didn't need a restroom break. I didn't need a snack. I had hit a wall in terms of, I think, just eating the rude comments, the berating, the tearing down of the trainee intraoperatively. When you asked about the hours and days leading up to it, I think that what's very telling is that I don't have much memory of that time. I was disassociated most of the months probably leading up to that event. And that dissociation, which became like semi-permanent at the time, it was a response to all of the ongoing trauma and brutality of the work. So that hopefully puts it a little bit into view.
It does. It does. And, in my own research about you, you write extensively about this, which is such a refreshing take because we don't see this point of view out there often. And you've written that in that moment, you thought, if I wasn't going to be a surgeon, then I wanted to die. Who was I without it? And I think that's something that people in very specific high intensity careers can understand. But can you help an audience member who may not resonate with a profession being the entirety of your identity, how that becomes fused with you? How does that work? And what did that feel like when you were in the field?
Yes, I do think this is important for us to talk about because it can be dangerous when somebody's entire identity is centered on their profession. Like that is dangerous because then if something goes wrong at work, it feels like an attack on the self. And so the more kind of, healthy perspective and distance we can put between those two things, I don't think that at all means we don't take our work seriously. We aren't consummate professionals with a great work ethic or anything. That space can exist. A lot of physicians don't create that space. And honestly, I think that what is frustrating for me is that it's kind of by design from the system and from the people who perpetuate the system. When you are in your 20s, they actually look for very three-dimensional, interesting, highly skilled people applying to medical school. That's a plus. Those are about some of just the brightest, most varied people that I meet. Like those personalities, they're very rich, they're very engaged with the world around them, and they will speak at length about all of their different hobbies. By the time that people finish medical school, they've put a lot into a dedicated residency application. They start narrowing down, getting more myopic. And then by the time that you are a resident, the switch has really, really flipped. For a resident physician at work to speak at length about a hobby, or let's say that they come in Monday morning and we say, well, how was everyone's weekend? And they say, it was amazing. I spent most of Saturday working on this new painting, something to that effect. Okay. 1 hour later, you're operating in the operating room. You're in the middle of a case and the attending starts pimping you. Pimping is the actual term that they use in medical education for just asking questions repeatedly of a learner. So they start pimping you. You don't know the answer. The very first thing that everyone's going to think and probably say is, you probably shouldn't have been painting on Saturday, right? Because you don't seem that prepared for this case. You didn't know the answer to that anatomical question. So truly, even for residents that I know where they tried when they could to fit in little hobbies, definitely don't bring it up at work because it will be weaponized against you. And of course, I am talking about one extreme. Of course, all my views are my own as a specialty surgeon. So cultures can differ a little bit in programs, but I think that the fact that this is still universal enough of a phenomenon to be a problem, um, it says a lot. And then the last thing that I want to mention in response to your question about how that night I really did not see a way, 10 p.m. that evening when I get home, I didn't see a way for me to like continue living. Like it was, I didn't know. What was interesting is that I did have like a husband, I had friends, I had pets, and even interest in some other areas of life.
Yeah.
I probably wasn't even centered on surgery, being a surgeon to the max, but what I thought would kill me was actually the shame. And that's why things like shame competence, I speak on, they're very important because I actually, even though I had other things that conceivably I wanted to be around for, the shame of going from surgeon as identity to then just saying, I'm going to walk away from that. I'll give that up, especially with all the moral failings that people ascribe to that, or maybe like the weakness and things like that. I really thought that the shame would kill me.
Wow. And I think that's very telling because in residency, but in medicine as a whole, the amount of years you're putting into this, right? What I said up top, you're giving up. A lot of these folks who start early too, your 20s, you're not out there with your friends on Tuesday nights getting dinner and drinks. You are either in the hospital or you're asleep for the few hours you can get it. And one thing that's very stand out to me, Frances May, is when you described when you did leave that day, there was those options of I'm quitting and throwing away all of these years that I just put in, or I'm taking 6 free counseling sessions and a week off, and then you finish the residency. And to me, 6 sessions a week for what this industry is, I guess, what was it like for you to realize that that was all the system had to offer at that point of break you were at?
Well, it was unsurprising because, of course, the disillusionment, had occurred prior to me hitting a wall. So I feel like I knew that there would not be help or support, no matter what. So, whether I hit this point or not, I didn't think that there would be help. So to be completely honest with you, I would say that the fact that they just told me, hey, take a week and think about it before you quit, that was a shockingly generous. That's not something that people are guaranteed. We don't have a right to that. That was actually like my mentor, I think, put in a good word and said, maybe if you let her cool down or think about it, she won't quit. You guys can't really afford to keep losing residents here. So, and the department couldn't. So they gave me the week and then the 6 sessions. That's ACGME mandated. All residents have access to those 6 sessions and it's per academic year. So this happened to me in December. I had 6 sessions and we literally had to budget them out, parse them out over the next few months. And then they refreshed 6 months from then. And I had 6 in my final year to use. And so what I did is really every 2 months, I had a regularly scheduled one, but I think that it maybe tells people a lot. Hopefully they can understand where I'm coming from when I say that whole chief year, I had 6 sessions, Q2 months or every 2 months. And so when I had an awful day at work and was crying on the floor at home, my husband would say, is this bad enough for us to move one of those sessions? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, then we'll just keep, then I would just drink vodka water until I fell asleep and then be back at work the next morning.
And that's very telling. And can you explain for folks who don't know, what is a session? What does that mean in the industry?
Yeah. 1 hour with a clinical psych PhD. Yeah. So, regular therapy to some, quote unquote. The reason why this was very important, though, and why I didn't have a regular therapist, I didn't have any therapy outside of this, is because many physicians and healthcare workers are fearful of seeking any therapy because then there's the concern that they would have to report that on all future licensing and credentialing. Right. There are intrusive questions which say, have you ever sought treatment for anxiety or depression or any mental health issues? And so that's very daunting. So the need to not leave any paper trail is crucial. And so these sessions with my doctor in this capacity were incredibly helpful. I mean, we got as much value as we could out of that 1 hour. They were free.
Yep.
And they were also not in the electronic medical record. He just had his own private, completely distinct from medical record notes. And that's every doctor's first question is like, are you putting records of this anywhere? And if so, what are you going to call it, et cetera? The last thing that I'll share that's relevant here is that when I was a resident of 4, I went to my primary care physician in distress. Like that was, again, I asked her for SSRIs.
Mm-hmm.
I had never taken them before in my life. But given my acute suicidality, I just was like, okay, I would like some help with this. She said no. She said, I don't think that you need them. And I think that this is directly a result of your environment. So she coded it as acute stress and gave me some mindfulness kinds of tools and tips. Yeah. And again, she was a great doctor. I'm not saying I wasn't presenting acutely suicidal in that interaction, because then of course there would have been like a duty to report that. But I'm saying it was kind of like near aftermath. And I was like, we're not doing great. Can I have SSRIs? And frankly, looking back all this time, she was 100% correct. It was acutely situational, but the question is, what can we do for people, others who are in this situation? Because I'm not
Right.
alone there.
Right. And you mentioned that being in year 4. Like that was a long time into this that finally it got to the point where you were like, I can't. I need to find outside help. My sister herself is a resident. And so for me, I've watched residency take its toll on her. I've watched it change her, maybe for better in some ways, but for worse in other ways. And so when you were in the thick of it, when you were in that initial stage of, wow, we just made it through medical school, I finally got to the place where it feels like I have more autonomy. Did you realize it quickly that it was changing you? You felt it in your everyday life? Or was it something where that awareness of what it was doing came in that year 4? Was that the final break?
That's an interesting question. I would say that I knew my second year that something was wrong. I would say that primarily what I was noticing, what was very obvious to me, was that something was wrong in the environment because I was watching these interactions that people were having that were like overtly hostile, abusive, aggressive
Right.
most days at work. So I think that I noticed it then, but again, what I was noticing was that like stuff outside of the body was going haywire. By third year, I knew that I had pretty much totally shut down. And so this goes back to, I mean, I was shut down for probably over a year before even quote unquote leaving the OR occurred. So, I mean, we all cope in our own ways. I definitely completely dissociated and shut down. I was for sure the worst version of a friend and girlfriend and daughter. And ultimately, what's really nefarious about these types of things is that it also made me a poorer coworker. I actually like everyone else, I came in loving the work, determined to study, really like studying. I've always been that way,
Right.
right? And it's crazy to watch this system crush people who literally are eager to learn, like to learn, want to be here. But when you're fearful showing up to work every day and when asking a question is met with, why the fuck don't you know that? Or get out, or read a fucking book. Those are all, like those were the types of responses we got. So you start to shut down, you stop wanting to learn, and you become worse off for all of it.
And the word you described about medicine is one I kind of want to dive into. You call it malignant, right? And for folks who've dealt with cancer or dealt with, hospice and et cetera, malignant means something that grows, spreads, and destroys. And obviously, correct me if I'm wrong in that definition. But for someone who's never been inside a hospital overnight, never worn scrubs for 30 hours straight, what does a malignant training environment actually look like?
Yeah, I think that there's a very significant additional mental burden that's placed on you. I think that, frankly, for somebody to make the accusation, oh, there's a malignant program or things like that, those are not based on one-off instances. Like maybe everyone does have a bad day. Certainly, I hope that even in the hospital, if you have a bad day, it's also okay to own it and apologize for it. I've certainly apologized to teammates at the end of a case. Hey, I'm sorry. I think I snipped at you there when, I asked for that instrument. I apologize. It was a stressful moment. That's not an excuse. Thank you for being here. Cause like we couldn't have done this case without you. That's an example of rhetoric that like I did practice that way. And I tried to be really diligent about that. It was never modeled for me in medicine or surgery. I've never seen somebody else do that, but I do encourage others to like really consider if, we can own our actions. It feels good to do that. But what a lot of doctors run away with is just being at the top of the hierarchy and then not needing to ever apologize or acknowledge wrongdoing. And then it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in terms of malignancy, so like I mentioned, I think that it being longitudinal, like a pattern of behavior or experiences, is definitely part of it because I've never heard somebody use that term as a one-off. And then I think that there's a lot that goes into it, and people may even use it to describe different aspects of training. But for me, when I use it, there was not psychological safety for, the trainees. There was constant bullying, like I would say pretty much daily. I think that, again, here's an example. We were in an elevator the 5 of us on the general team were taking the elevator up to go see our first patient for rounds. So it's 5:45 in the morning. And the senior resident was screaming at one of the more junior residents. And what they were saying was, "You're so fucking ugly. I can't even look at your face for another second. Go face the back corner of this elevator." And the elevator was legitimately like only big enough for 5 people. So we're all sardined in there. Now this person's standing facing the back corner, staying facing the wall. You can hear him like crying a little bit. And like in that scenario, I'm just another member of the team, right? Like I'm just riding the elevator. I'm trying to survive myself. Everybody else is totally quiet. We get up there and we step off and we start seeing patients in the morning. And so I think that there's obviously a lot of things wrong with this. And for instance, even when like, I do not think it's okay to speak to other people that way. But did I intervene and then get my own head, chopped off? No. Patience even. Because I appreciate that I know you're linking this to like, this matters. It matters because I want physicians to be well for a myriad of reasons, including better patient care and things like that. Because imagine being the first patient that we saw on rounds that day.
Yep.
Because you're getting woken up at 5:50, out of the darkness, and a really quite strange vibe to the group that just shuffled in here, right? Like one person's crying in the back, everyone else is terrified, silent, and then there's one person like kind of telling you your overnight updates. Like this matters. It affects everyone and it really matters.
It really does. Frances May, when someone and if someone did push back and said, you can't speak to someone like that, a resident to the attending or to, what would the outcome be? Would it just be another slap to them or could it actually affect your career? What would that look like?
I think more the latter, honestly. I wouldn't even be shocked if, because I don't know. So frankly, I'm scanning my memories. I've never seen that happen. That says a lot also about the hierarchy in medicine and surgery. I have never seen it. And I do think that it seems plausible to me. I'm just postulating, even if it then got dropped, because it might just be kind of like a dirty look and then we drop it and we move on. But I would say that would be a permanent target on your back. That's like, this person was insubordinate. Because the second that you get accused of being insubordinate, then that means that now, that probably could pay off very poorly for the person who tried to speak. And frankly, I don't think that they would have effectively, protected the other person.
Right.
I will say that what I have done in the past as a resident was go and apologize later. I talk about that a little bit in my book, but like even weeks later, hey, I want to pull you aside and just privately have this convo, which is that was messed up what happened. I'm sorry I didn't speak up. Like I was afraid. That's not okay. But please know that I really didn't think it was acceptable for them to say that to you or treat you like that. Like literally things like that happened. And hopefully, that it's better than nothing. It's what I came up with.
Right. Now you talked about it too, because it's really two-pronged, isn't it? There's this hierarchy of the attendings and the higher up folks being able to and taught that they can speak that way because they went through it, right?
Yeah.
It's hazing in that way where it's like, I had to deal with this, so now you have to fight your way up the ladder too. And then there's the other end where the doctors in residency, right, are being told resiliency. Keep pushing and keep going. This is what you were doing all this school for, what you were made to do. You push back on the framing of resiliency a lot. Why do you think that the resiliency narrative is damaging to residents and doctors as a whole?
Yeah, I do think that we got conned a little bit on that one. I just think that, the institutions in medicine, certainly the word came up in the zeitgeist. They ran with it. I don't know how expansive, medicine's very insular. So we don't have that expansive of vocabulary. So resilience kind of broke through. They took it, they ran with it. And I've only really ever seen it weaponized against, like, certainly my era and the people who have followed us. I've seen it only weaponized because that's what I'm trying to push back on and flip on its head. I can tell you in my experience, 13, 14 years since I started my journey into the hospital, I don't know any doctors who don't meet actual thoughtful definitions of resilient. right? Because like if we're actually looking at this reasonably, like take a step back, have some perspective. Same goes for medical students. Think of what medical students select for. Like these people are extraordinarily resilient.
Yeah.
What it's very easy for the systems in power to do is anytime employees, workers are getting dumped on or taken advantage of, right? You could just say, well, you be more resilient. I'm putting this back on you. Ball's in your court. And
Right.
if you ask for help, that means that you weren't resilient,
Right.
right? It just feels like that's what the dynamic has been reduced to. Um, again, there are other things. Doctors are not perfect people by any means. I just do not think that resilient is in even the top 3 that you could, leverage against them.
Right. Right. And something we mentioned in the top of the conversation too is just like the statistics. And I always like to be I'm a journalist myself, is this is what's readily available. These are the statistics that we know of. So when we say that female doctors are facing a 76% of higher risk of suicide in this career, that's just what we know because of the environment that's created that they don't feel comfortable talking about it. 15% struggling with addiction, just what we know that's reported that people are able to kind of get out into the zeitgeist. When you do hear statistics like that, having lived this, what does it tell you about where we're at? Where does it tell you about what the residents, what the med students, what the doctors are feeling in this moment with this large, overarching kind of collapse of mental health in the industry?
Absolutely. And even physical health, by the way, because obviously living under these conditions chronically for years then gets to the physical health. And I think that you framed it beautifully here. The issue is that people do not want to hear that doctors are not well. And I completely get that. Like if my loved one has to have surgery and then, knowing what I know, yeah, I have some concerns. Like you don't want it to be true, but I think we can all agree as much as we don't want something to be true, ignoring it does not help. And so these are the realities. I will say that the quoted substance use 15% sounds outrageously low to me because we know that physicians are self-medicating with alcohol, probably in increasing years also with marijuana type products as well. But like the self-medicating very quietly, to try and cope
Yep.
or process some of what happens at work, that is a pretty um, common experience. Not only that, but there's a lot of interesting cultural and societal things at play where it's not uncommon in medical school to start really, really drinking.
Right.
And this is a group of people who put off drinking in college and while putting together a medical school application. So there's arrested development, that element of it. Then there's also the coping element of it. I think that it says a lot that in some of these studies, which I'm glad that there's more literature coming out about, but when they looked at female physicians, even matched to other high achieving professions, like let's say lawyers and stuff like that. I mean, literally longevity and health are being disproportionately impacted for physicians. And so I really do think that that's damning. You can't just say, well, women can't handle a fast paced, stressful workplace.
I think that's why these studies that are coming out, and I scoured the internet, Frances May, to find what little I could, because no one wants to hear it. Exactly. No one wants to hear that the doctors are struggling, but also no one wants to tell them the world that they're struggling as a doctor. And you mentioned this when you were in residency. You started creating resources for residents, the things you wished, you had that existed when you were Googling physician suicide in the bathroom. So it was called Rethinking Residency. What was driving you in those early days? Were you trying to save others? Were you still trying to save yourself? Was it a combination of it all?
Really just the former, I would say. My husband and I created Rethinking Residency, and we did it because we said, if this helps even one person, totally worth it. So we did make that website, fortunately, it was just, we put a lot of our own time into it. It doesn't cost a ton to create like a company and a website that just puts out free resources.
Right.
Um, so yeah, but, and I think that the healing that I got from it was just the satisfaction of like, I do think I helped a couple people with it. So
Yeah.
that was healing for me to do that.
What sort of resources, when you started to create it, did you think would be most helpful for doctors at that time, for residents at that time to have?
the uber practical ones, I think. And for instance, I did not find back then, especially as a resident, I didn't find like general inspirational, general motivational or wellness tips to be accessible or helpful at all. In fact, they were alienating. They just made me angrier. And so I wouldn't say that it's, rethinking residency. It's just positive vibes. It's just like, this is your calling. This is the work that brings great meaning to you. And if you stopped finding meaning in it, you're probably a bad person. There's all sorts of implications that you could go down because people start to blame themselves when they're burnt out or their soul is kind of crushed.
Right.
So what's helpful is, and a lot of the skills are DBT informed, adapted with the help of a clinical psych PhD. We have multiple clinical psych PhDs who we worked with to develop just, again, high quality content, but also very specific. Because as a resident, if you start Googling toxic workplace, stressful meeting with boss, all this stuff, the advice of go take a walk around the block, look at something green, put on music that's soothing to you. That is so not adaptable for the resident physician. They are on the move. You can't put whatever music you want on in the OR. You can't leave the hospital and walk around the block in 99% of cases.
Right.
That's like a rare treat. It's very hard to go outside even. So adapting a lot of these skills that are okay, here's how to do a vagal nerve reset. Go find a kidney basin. Go to the nearest food and beverage room at the hospital. Find a kidney basin. Fill it with ice and water. You can do a face dunk. Again, just really practical things that actually could fit into the workflow for a resident.
That's interesting. I get that. So more things that it's not like a session, right? It's not like a talking to a therapist, but it's more like, what can I do in the time that I have realistically in this job that can make it a bit easier in this moment?
Exactly. And as a practitioner of yoga all through residency, I appreciate there's obviously calming poses. It's okay, do this with your arms and stuff. In the operating room, if you are under duress, you cannot break scrub. That means that you get a small square in front of your abdomen torso, and your hands cannot leave that. So what kinds of poses or positioning can be done that don't break scrub? Because the only thing that's going to make your day even worse is if you've now contaminated it.
Right. A line I read that you wrote that I thought was very profound, and I kind of want to dig into it, is I believed then and still do that shame dies in the sunlight. I think that that's a very profound way of viewing what this is that you've kind of gone through. But I wanted to dig deeper, having been in the place you were where you were speaking out, right? You were one of the few physicians talking about it. What was the response from institutions and colleagues from when you started to say, I'm not going to be silent about how this is being handled or how I'm being treated anymore?
Yeah, interesting. I would say, institutions, they don't interact with me. Part of the good thing about leaving academia is that I don't have an institution that I answer to. And so I would say what inevitable criticisms or things like that, if it even reached their desk, it didn't come my way. We don't have existing channels of communication. So hopefully they just can't find me or send me hate mail or things like that.
Right.
Interestingly, I will say that, some of the more backlash from younger physicians, even including one of my colleagues. So when I started rethinking residency, I sent it out to just a focus group, 12 people. Hey, does this look like anything to you? How could we improve the website even before launch? One person, and this was from a friend. This was from a trusted friend in a tiny focus group. It was a med school friend. And they said, this is just kind of pointless. They were like, this is pointless and it's nothing. And they said, all residents have unions now. So we don't really need stuff like this. It's just, it's redundant. It's out of touch. That shocked me. You could have knocked me over with a feather because I was like, what are you talking about? And it just so happened that person trained at a program with a union. And I think that this is so important for us to talk about, psychologically, think about that. That was a friend's real response. They trained at one of the only institutions in the country completely unionized. And so part of the reason why this work is really hard to do is because I get that there's like a lot of heterogeneity, and certainly some of the stuff I speak to as a surgeon, not applicable in some of the medicine specialties, things like that.
Yeah.
But I do think that that type of backlash, it's tough. My response to that formally across the board is that if somebody has a great residency experience or even a okay one, very happy for them. I love that for them. We are trying to bring the floor up for everyone.
Right.
It's tough because it means that means that you have to care about, people outside of yourself, but hopefully we can do that. And having experienced the far other side of the spectrum where we were marooned out in the middle of nowhere, really no support, no oversight, I know that that is happening at many places. We are worried about them. Can we all agree to bring up the floor on residency training
Right.
so that we don't just continue to perpetuate all these awful things that, by the way, follow attendings throughout their career?
Right.
Because you don't just magically turn 40 and then drop all of the trauma incurred earlier on.
Exactly. And I want to move to Hippocratic Collective a bit, because that is where, you've said where your story wasn't enough to make the seismic change in the industry. And that's an unfortunate part of any of these industries that challenge people to this level. But Hippocratic Collective has a media powerhouse ideal and identity, right? And I'm very interested by that because it's not a nonprofit. It's not a lobbying group. You chose media. Why do you think that was an approach that could reach people where they were at in a very different way than those others?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I do think, in part, this conception was because myself and my colleagues there, we knew that there is just nothing cool made for doctors, frankly, and not anything cool made by doctors. So there was this like pop cultural relevance piece of it that we wanted to do that we hadn't been seeing in medicine before. And in terms of why it's a media company, I love the Peter Drucker quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." I believe in trying to change these things from pretty much every level. And of course, hopefully I come across as a person who has like a plan A through a plan Z.
Yeah.
So I have gone to ACGME meetings. Like I do believe in the more that we can do systems-based change and maybe like some rule change. But guess what? Going back to my experience, I also know that like the 80-hour work week rule, things like that, that's existed for many years now. People have been breaking it ever since the day that it got, enacted.
Yeah.
And so the culture eats strategy for breakfast invites us to move into an area that's a vacuum, which is like medical and surgical culture. A lot of it is outdated. A lot of it is not very intentional, not organized. And so by putting a media company out there with diverse personalities, by the way, and that's what we want. We never, it's not like one doctor and their more narrow opinions. It's just that if every person who's 23 years old and starts working in a hospital knows that they can go to the HC and find something useful and relatable to them, which just might mean like maybe one person's work, one or two people's work out of the whole collective, that's great. Then we have succeeded, like even companies like The Ringer have done. The other last thing that I'll just mention about it, because I wanted to call back to, shame dies in the sunlight. I am very aware that sharing my journey for the past 8 months or so has meant that I go first, the loud quitting. Definitely, I don't know any attendings who left clinical practice, with strong like academic evidence-based backgrounds where, yeah, they really bought into a certain point and then they left and they did so publicly or loudly. I didn't have role models like that. I got to connect with a bunch of really brilliant people who did it kind of on the DL, but I think it's important for people to see it. Not only that, but it would not bother me if people who are like struggling in their program or see some BS happen in their program, if they were willing to name it or speak about it or share their own stories, because they're like, this is not as embarrassing or shameful or loserish as what Frances May did. I literally, I am neurodivergent. I have a really great group of people in my life. So if I can, in that fashion, just still like destigmatize it and make it so that you can use me as the litmus of like, well, if I'm not as chuggy as her, then I'm doing okay. great, because I do think that we can help people that way, and it just usually takes somebody going first.
Right. And as you coined it, you survived an ego death, right? And I think that that's is what so many of the doctors that, at least in my own life, I've loved and known is, yeah, you spend so much time, committing yourself to this career, and it's one of which people in the room stop and look at you when you say you're a surgeon or you're a doctor here. It's a hard thing. So when you were the first one to do it, because you didn't have any role models, was it, yes, it was terrifying, but what did that feel like, and what died in that sense? When you say you survived that ego death, what was it that died and what was
Mhm.
left?
I think that what's important is that fortunately, like, I was in control of the narrative. I announced it on my own time. Like, I do connect with a lot of physicians where, like, those decisions, their career is taken from them, or it's somebody else's decision, or it's circumstantial, or other things. So I definitely empathize with that. That's very different. I had the luxury of, I knew and prepared for a long time. I did a lot of work, and the ego death happened long before. Basically, if I hadn't had done all the work and experienced the ego death like a year, 6 months prior to leaving, then I think the backlash to me leaving would have been
Mm,
quite threatening to my, like, health and mental wellness,
mhm.
right? But I did it, and certainly writing the book was a big part of that. But I will say, like, that was something that was a gift for me and my journey. The ability to have a long ramp to it, do it on my own time, totally my decision.
Right.
And those things do all feel good. Like, it would be a lot harder, and it often takes people longer to get to that point,
Yeah.
again, in other circumstances.
Talk to me then about the book. Like, was that a almost life in the making sort of thing? Like, I can't imagine like how that all came to be day by day throughout this process.
Yes, I cannot wait. This is my first book, but I love my work as a writer now. So it's a big part of my life, shockingly, even though it was no part of my life 5 years ago, none. So essentially, that first year that I was an attending, I was building the practice from the ground up. But about 6 months in, around the time that I was working on rethinking residency, I did start writing a few essays out of residency. And I had good notes of stuff that happened when it happened. Like, I actually did keep records of that stuff just personally. And so I wrote those essays. And then I thought, I really would love to publish like a compilation of essays or something like that. Like, people should know what's going on. Because
Yeah.
again, this goes back to, I know that none of us like that this is going on. Certainly, patients will not feel comfortable with
Yep.
it. It is an uncomfortable topic,
Yeah.
but people should know. So I want to get these out there. What I learned pretty quickly is that if you're not famous, which I'm not famous, I had 100 followers on a private Instagram account. You can't really publish a compilation of essays. Those are for celebrities or also already big literary figures. But it's certainly not. It's not a debut, book for
Yeah.
for a new writer.
Yeah.
I joined a 1 year long writers group with Neil Strauss, who I view to be as, a leader in literary nonfiction. Like, I really loved his approach to the art, and I deliberately have never gone towards or been compelled by like narrative medicine. There are programs for doctors, there's like writing for doctors. I wanted writing for writers. I wanted writing for artists
Yeah.
because that was part of me. Like, and I think that there's a real difference. I think there's a real difference in the artistic approach and the learning and things like that. So I did the writers group, learned how to create a real narrative arc, and then really overhauled the whole project and wrote the book. And that was, over 2 years ago now. So it was a long journey. I got my literary agent out after about 6 months of querying, and it's surreal, but the book comes out in a few weeks.
It's very exciting. And who do you want the audience to be of this, and what do you want their takeaways to be?
I do want it to be for everyone. This is not a book, unlike the HC. The Hippocratic Collective is a media company that certainly is more geared toward, it's for healthcare workers,
Right.
and it's from within. This book and a lot of my personal work is for everybody. It's for everybody who likes Grey's Anatomy, is interested in medical stories. It's for people who watch The Resident, who love The Pit right now,
Right.
or their family members are doctors. There's a lot that is directly relevant and useful to women in male-dominated fields
Mm,
and high-achieving female professionals. Um, and so but I do think that it also invites us to have these conversations about how can patient care possibly be the best that it could be
yeah.
when it's competing in this milieu. And it's a very honest look behind the curtain that in a lot of ways is more honest than some of these shows can be. Because on the shows,
Mm.
everyone has to be hot, and nobody's hot in this book.
Sure, sure. No, I think that's really great because it's this two-pronged approach, right? Where it's I want to reach everybody to understand and almost humanize what the profession is, but also the people who are still almost stuck in it. And I don't know if it's fair to compare what residency can be to being in a fraternity or to being in a cult at times where, it's this level of I have to prove myself and I'm okay to do anything to prove it. But when it comes to HC, the Hippocratic Collective, when it comes to the book, what is your long-term vision? Like if everything planned and went the way it did, what would look different in medicine in 10 years to you?
Wow, that's a great question. So, and it's interesting because they are like two different areas of my life. The book, my career as a writer, I would love for there to be like the next book deal this year. I'm already working on my second book. So that's but that's Frances May the girl, with my writer hat on and with my professional, author work. So that's what I want to put out into the universe and manifest in that regard. In terms of the Hippocratic Collective in 10 years from now, 10 years from now, it could really look enormously different. And that even includes like structurally, like there are probably digital health companies either that already exist or ones that don't exist yet that in 10 years from now would, acquire a media company to help amplify like the importance of all these things and also bring together like tech and media. So I think that there's basically a lot of interesting ways that this could look in 10 years.
Right.
I am such a surgeon by nature. Like the surgeon personality is like the fix it now personality.
Yeah.
And so from that standpoint, like my 3-year plan is that we have already normalized so many new conversations, topics of discussions, admissions. We have surgeons who talk very authentically about what it's like to have a complication in the OR.
Right.
These are conversations traditionally kept very secret, very obfuscated, because who would ever admit that? That's not really in service to the physicians or to the patients to, again, willfully act like it didn't happen.
Yeah.
But that doesn't give us any tools to handle. There's a famous quote, which is, if you don't have any complications, any surgical complications, you're not operating enough. That's a famous saying. That's been around for a long time. Surgeons have been saying that for a long time, just internally and kind of in group to each other. And then there's this other layer of it, which is that when someone has a complication, there's often no support, a lot of shame, a lot that comes with that, an inability to speak about it. So
No, I'm glad you said that. And Frances May, it's something that you kind of mentioned up top too, when you were in that stage of your life and you had the folks around you. You had your husband, you had, animals and whatnot. With my sister as well, one thing I've noticed is how it does affect the people around, right? The relationship shift that does exist in this way. How would you say if you noticed that shift in your own life? I know that you said you were a bad daughter at that time and all of this. What was it about the situation, to kind of go back there, that made the relationships that much harder? Was it the anger, exhaustion? What kind of made it as such?
yeah, I think probably just the reactivity across the board. It was like off the charts. Like I always was in fight or flight or completely dissociated. So I guess either I would be reactive and lashing out, or the alternative would be you just couldn't connect with me because I'm sitting, on my phone or something like
Right.
that, like totally disconnected. And I do think that it is not modeled for us. Like, we don't even see attendings regulate their emotions very well.
Right.
And obviously there's some exceptions, but the by far and away norm is you don't have to regulate your emotions in the hospital, and
Right.
you can just traumatize everybody else, and you can do these things. It's totally permitted.
Right. And I like to kind of take it back to, obviously, there's somebody right now in a OR or in a bathroom in a hospital wearing their scrubs that hasn't slept, that they're wondering if they made a mistake choosing this life. What would you want them to hear from someone like you who's done it all?
Yeah, I think I go back to these 3 questions. I think that they're the best, the most clarifying, because of course, like, I would never want somebody who wants to be a doctor to feel discouraged from being that. It's incredibly important work. I actually do think that it's sacred work. It's important work. That doesn't mean that if you choose to leave it, that you're a bad person or you've shirked some kind of like moral duty or anything like that. But it's it's wonderful when it aligns with what you want out of life. And so these are the 3 questions. Number 1, what do you want out of life? Number 2, why do you want it? And number 3 is, what are you willing to do or not do to get it?
Mhm.
Because I really do think that even that third piece and this element of like, it feels really good to own your decisions. People who feel like, well, I just did this because my parents really wanted me to be a doctor and now my life is terrible and I never sleep. Like, this is very onerous. It feels more onerous in that way compared to even one of my colleagues who I'm thinking of. She wanted to be a surgeon since she was 4 years old. And guess what? Even though we experienced a lot of the same environments and a lot of the same abuse, she did receive it very differently. And, yeah, probably metabolize it differently. I think that's a good word for it. So I am all about just more like being willing to have that perspective, own your own decisions. Like, my job, my work now is not magically the most fun job. I'm not like Selena Gomez suddenly. I
Right.
still work really hard and my work is not perfect. The work
Right.
day is not perfect. However, if it does feel really good. And even if something goes late into the night or crosses over into my personal time or things like that, I mean, it feels good because I really, really chose it and I was thoughtful and this aligns with what I want.
Right. Right. And after everything you've been through too, I'm sure it's not all bad, right? There is so much hope that still exists out there with the Hippocratic Collective and the doctors and physicians that you now work with who feel the same way, striving to make things better. What makes you, I guess, what keeps driving you that this kind of problem can be changed, that we can fix it, we can find a solution?
Well, I really do think that I am in large part driven by a genuine belief that doctors deserve better. And I should specify, like, the next generation of doctors deserves better. This truly is a profession that, like, attracts, a lot of really brilliant, promising young people and then just destroys them. And those people had, like, other options available to them, and they could have had these, like, really beautiful careers, I think.
Yeah.
Um, the contrapositive of that I just wanna mention really quickly, something that I experienced a lot is that when I was in residency, I would speak with older mentors. So, women and men, but definitely women in surgery who were older, and I would share these stories. Or even, for instance, I'm also thinking of a woman in medicine, so she wasn't a surgeon, maybe 20 years or so ahead of me. When I shared my stories from residency, she said, and I think she's a good example because she had never been in an OR for 20 years. She was
Mm,
just thinking back to her med school days. I shared my stories with her and she said, wow, it was exactly like that when I trained.
wow.
I thought that they had fixed that by now. So I heard that a lot of places, and that does not sit well with me. That I think is a real problem. And I actually think that, yeah, a lot of these things are much older than we even imagine in terms of culture at the hospital. And, um, you know, the system when you look at heuristics, like the system's always going to protect itself. There's no reason for the system to change any of these cultural aspects. And so I hope that I can do so in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. And I think that what you're doing right now by just talking about it, right? Like that's the purpose of this podcast too. Is these are the types of stories that need to be out into the world. And I think as we're getting this hopefully moment in history where we're no longer going to be silent about abuse and pain and restrictions on living a normal life, it's really incredible what you're doing. Frances May, we always end our episodes asking, the same question. If you could put one underreported story on the front page of every newspaper in America tomorrow, a story that isn't getting the attention it deserves, what would it be and why?
Wow, that's an amazing question. Okay. I think that what is really fascinating, there's been kind of like increased interest a bit in this topic, is like autoimmune disease in women, including in high achieving female professionals. There's like these interesting kind of associations in terms of what chronic stress, chronically like living, in these environments,
Yeah.
and also just women and high achieving female professionals are often the ones to like eat any extra work that gets dumped on them, just kind of like grit your teeth and bear it.
Yep.
But I do think that, I guess that for me, I'm very interested in, because of course it does personally, it's personally of great interest. What are the health sequelae of living in that work environment for years and decades? But I do know, autoimmune disorders specifically are an interesting area within that, because of course, otherwise we could talk all day about TMJ and migraines and ulcers and things
Right.
like that.
No, that's a good one. That's crazy. I need to look more into that myself. I've not even thought there was a link in that kind of thing. Well, you've given me food for thought, so thank you for that. Dr. Frances May Hardin, thank you so much for being so radically honest on this podcast today. Everything about the Hippocratic Collective and her new book out next week will be in the link to the bios on all the channels. And her podcast, Surgeon Interrupted, you can listen to wherever you listen. So thank you so much for joining Frances May.
Thank you, Tara.